For years, Lee Min-Seok had treated love like a bad investment. Women surrounded him constantly. Heiresses from powerful families, famous actresses, international models, but none of them ever managed to hold his attention for more than a few seconds. In Seoul's elite business circles, people had a nickname for him: the Untouchable Billionaire. Some said he was simply too disciplined to care about romance. Others whispered that his heart had been replaced with cold calculation. But everyone agreed on one thing: Lee Min-Seok would never fall in love. Especially not with a black woman. He had said it himself. Loudly. Confidently. And his best friend Jae-hyun Kim had laughed when he heard it. "Careful," Jae-hyun told him over dinner that night. "Arrogant promises like that have a way of coming back to embarrass you." Min-Seok simply smirked. "You want proof," he said. "I'll make you a bet," Jae-hyun replied. Min-Seok raised an eyebrow. "One day," Jae-hyun continued calmly, "you're going to meet a woman who proves you completely wrong." Min-Seok accepted the bet without hesitation. To him, it was the easiest win of his life. But neither of them knew that across the city, on a crowded street corner filled with rushing commuters and impatient traffic, a woman named Zuri Johnson was standing in the afternoon sun handing out flyers. And in less than 5 minutes, she was about to yell at the wrong car. The moment everything changes. "Hey! Watch where you're going." The black luxury sedan stopped so suddenly its tires screeched against the pavement. Zuri Johnson stepped back from the crosswalk, clutching the stack of colorful flyers in her hand. "You almost ran me over," she snapped toward the tinted window. The driver froze. Pedestrians slowed. Because the car she had just shouted at wasn't ordinary. It belonged to Lee Min-Seok. The door opened slowly. Security guards moved first, stepping out onto the sidewalk like silent shadows. Then Min-Seok emerged. Immaculately dressed. Calm in the way powerful men always were. People on the street immediately recognized him. Some stepped aside. Others lowered their voices. But Zuri didn't move. She folded her arms and stared directly at him. "Rich people don't own the road," she said. The guards stiffened. No one spoke to Lee Min-Seok like that. Ever. Min-Seok stepped forward, ready to shut down the confrontation with the same cold authority he used in boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations. But then he actually looked at her. Really looked. The confidence. The fire in her eyes. The fact that she clearly had no idea who he was. For a moment, the billionaire who controlled entire corporations forgot what he had planned to say. Because something strange, something unfamiliar had just happened. For the first time in years, Lee Min-Seok was interested. And somewhere across the city, Jae-hyun Kim's bet had just taken its first step toward becoming reality. Lee Min-Seok believed emotions were liabilities. Not because he had never experienced them, but because he had learned very early in life what they could cost. From the outside, his life looked perfect. At 32, he was one of the youngest billionaires in South Korea, the chairman of a multinational investment empire that stretched from Seoul to Singapore. His days were filled with strategy meetings, acquisitions, and negotiations that moved millions of dollars with a single signature. Control defined everything he did. Control over his companies. Control over his reputation. Control over himself. The media admired him. Business rivals feared him. Elite families across Korea quietly competed for his attention, hoping their daughters might catch the interest of the powerful billionaire. But none of them ever did. At charity galas and private parties, beautiful women tried to approach him constantly. Some were charming, some were ambitious. Some came from families powerful enough to influence entire industries. Min-Seok ignored them all with polite indifference. His assistants had learned long ago that if a meeting included even the slightest hint of matchmaking, he would cancel it immediately. Romance in his mind was inefficient. Love created distractions. Attachments created vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities were dangerous in a world built on power. The idea had hardened into a belief over the years, something he rarely questioned. Which was why the conversation with Jae-hyun the night before had felt so ridiculous to him. The two men had known each other since university. Jae-hyun was one of the very few people who could speak honestly to Min-Seok without worrying about his status or influence. They had been sitting in a quiet corner of a private restaurant, the city lights of Seoul glowing beyond the glass windows. "You're 32, Jae-hyun had said casually while pouring himself another drink. "And you've never had a real relationship." Min-Seok didn't look up from the report on his tablet. "I've had plenty of relationships," he replied calmly. Jae-hyun snorted. "Business partnerships don't count." Min-Seok set the tablet down slowly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Jae-hyun said with a grin, "that one day you're going to meet someone who completely messes up your perfect system." Min-Seok leaned back in his chair, amused. "That won't happen." "Why not?" "Because I don't allow it to." Jae-hyun studied him for a moment before asking, "So you're saying there's no woman on earth who could change your mind?" Min-Seok shrugged. "None." Jae-hyun raised an eyebrow. "Not even a black woman?" Min-Seok gave a short laugh, the answer immediate. "Especially not." The confidence in his voice had been absolute. To Min-Seok, love was just another unpredictable variable in life. And unpredictable variables were something he had spent his entire career eliminating. What he didn't know was that somewhere in the city, a woman with fierce eyes and a stack of cheap paper flyers was about to become the one variable he could never control. Jae-hyun Kim had known Lee Min-Seok long enough to recognize the exact moment his friend crossed the line between confidence and arrogance. It was subtle. Min-Seok never raised his voice. He never boasted loudly like other wealthy men. His arrogance came wrapped in calm certainty, the quiet belief that he understood the world better than everyone else. And the moment he said, "especially not," Jae-hyun knew he had found it. For a few seconds, Jae-hyun simply studied him across the dinner table. The restaurant around them was silent in that expensive way only elite places manage to achieve. Soft music floated through the air, glasses clinked gently in the distance, and the glowing skyline of Seoul shimmered beyond the tall windows. Min-Seok picked up his wine glass again, clearly finished with the conversation. To him the matter was settled. But Jae-hyun wasn't finished. "You know," he said slowly, "I've heard you say a lot of confident things over the years." Min-Seok glanced at him. But that one might be the most ridiculous." Min-Seok smirked faintly. "You're welcome to think so." Jae-hyun leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Let's make a bet." Min-Seok raised an eyebrow, mildly amused. "A bet?" "Yes." "About what?" Jae-hyun's smile widened slightly, the kind of smile that meant he had already decided something. "One day," he said calmly, "you're going to meet a woman who completely destroys that little theory of yours." Min-Seok didn't hesitate. "That's impossible." "That's what makes it interesting." Min-Seok gave a quiet laugh and shook his head. "You're underestimating how much control I have over my life." Jae-hyun tapped the table lightly with his finger. "No," he said. "I think you're underestimating how unpredictable life is." Min-Seok didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied his friend the same way he studied potential business partners. Measuring, calculating, deciding whether the challenge was worth entertaining. Finally he asked, "And what exactly happens if you're wrong?" Jae-hyun shrugged. "If I'm wrong, I'll admit you were right about everything." Min-Seok's expression remained calm. "And if you're right?" Jae-hyun leaned forward slightly. "If I'm right, you admit that even Lee Min-Seok can't control everything." For a moment neither man spoke. The bet itself wasn't important, but the challenge behind it was. Min-Seok had built his entire life around control. Control over money, power, decisions, and reputation. The idea that something as irrational as love could slip past that control felt almost laughable. He picked up his glass again, swirling the wine slowly before taking a sip. Then he nodded once. "Fine." Jae-hyun smiled. "You're accepting." Min-Seok set the glass down. "Yes." The answer came with quiet certainty. Because in his mind there was no real risk. Love was for people who lacked discipline. And Lee Min-Seok had never lacked discipline in his life. Across the table, Jae-hyun watched him carefully, the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. Because he had a feeling this might become the most entertaining bet he had ever made. Neither of them realized that fate had already begun arranging the moment that would prove one of them wrong. The next afternoon, Seoul moved with its usual relentless rhythm. Traffic crawled through the narrow streets, vendors shouted over the noise of passing cars, and pedestrians flowed along the sidewalks in hurried waves. It was the kind of chaos Lee Min-Seok rarely noticed. Most days he traveled from one private building to another, surrounded by glass offices and quiet boardrooms far above the noise of the city. Today was different. His black sedan rolled slowly through a busy commercial district, caught in a line of cars waiting for the traffic light ahead to change. Inside the vehicle, Min-Seok sat in the back seat reviewing a financial report on his tablet while his driver navigated the crowded street. Numbers moved across the screen in clean rows of profit margins and projections. Predictable. Controlled. Exactly the way he preferred things. "Sir," the driver said carefully, "there's someone crossing." Min-Seok barely looked up. Then the brakes slammed. The sudden stop jerked the car forward just enough to snap his attention toward the windshield. Outside, a young woman stumbled backward off the crosswalk, a stack of colorful papers scattering across the pavement. For a moment everything froze. Then the woman straightened quickly, brushing dust from her jeans as she glared toward the car. "Seriously," she shouted. "Watch where you're driving." The driver looked horrified. Pedestrians nearby slowed, sensing tension. Inside the car, Min-Seok lifted his gaze fully for the first time. Through the windshield he saw her clearly now. She stood in the middle of the street gathering the fallen flyers with quick movements, clearly annoyed rather than frightened. Most people reacted differently when a luxury sedan nearly hit them. They panicked, apologized, or immediately tried to avoid trouble. This woman did none of those things. Instead, she walked directly toward the car. Before the driver could react, she tapped sharply on the hood. "Your brakes work, right?" she called out. "Maybe try using them earlier next time." The driver glanced nervously at Min-Seok in the rearview mirror. "Sir, It's fine," Min-Seok said quietly. The door opened. The moment he stepped out, the energy of the street shifted. People recognized him. Whispers moved quickly through the crowd. But the woman in front of him didn't seem to notice. She was still crouched slightly, collecting the last of the fallen flyers from the ground. A few strands of dark curls had slipped loose from her high puff, and sunlight caught the gold hoops in her ears as she stood again. When she looked up, their eyes met. For the first time, Min-Seok saw her properly. Her skin glowed warmly in the afternoon light. Her expression carried a fierce kind of confidence, the kind that came from someone used to standing her ground. And her eyes held absolutely no fear. She didn't bow. She didn't apologize. She simply looked at him and said, "You almost ruined my entire shift." Min-Seok blinked once. Because in all the years he had spent surrounded by people who treated him like someone untouchable, no one had ever spoken to him like that. And strangely enough, he didn't feel offended. He felt curious. Across the busy street the traffic light turned green. But neither of them moved. Zuri Johnson finished gathering the last of the scattered flyers and straightened up, brushing her hands together like the moment had already ended. Around them, the street had gone strangely quiet. People recognized the man standing beside the black sedan. A few pedestrians slowed their steps, whispering to each other. Even the driver remained frozen beside the car door, clearly unsure how the situation would unfold. But Zuri didn't notice any of that. She glanced down at the slightly wrinkled flyers in her hands and sighed. "Great," she muttered. "There goes half my stack." Min-Seok studied her calmly. Up close, she looked even younger than he had first thought. Maybe mid-20s. Her clothes were simple. Faded jeans, worn sneakers, a fitted black tank top. But there was nothing uncertain about the way she carried herself. Confidence radiated from her like heat. "You're standing in the middle of the road," he said evenly. She looked up at him again, eyebrows lifting. And you were driving through a crosswalk. For a moment Min-Seok had no response. That almost never happened. Most people who recognized him immediately changed their tone. Their voices softened, their posture shifted, their words became careful. This woman did the opposite. She crossed her arms. Look, she continued, I'm not trying to start a fight. But if I'd taken one more step, your car would have flattened me. The driver opened his mouth nervously. Miss, do you realize who? Min-Seok raised a hand slightly. The driver fell silent. Zuri watched the exchange, a hint of curiosity flickering across her face. Who what? She asked. Min-Seok met her gaze. You're handing out flyers, he said instead. She blinked once, clearly not expecting the change in topic. Yeah, she replied. He glanced at the colorful paper in her hand. The design was simple but bright, advertising a nightclub event scheduled for the weekend. Club Aurora, he read aloud. Zuri nodded. 50 cents per flyer, she said casually. Not glamorous, but it pays. Min-Seok looked at the stack again. Is that why you're standing in traffic? Technically, she said. I was standing on the crosswalk. The corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. For the first time since stepping out of the car, Min-Seok realized something strange. She still hadn't asked his name. Hadn't apologized. Hadn't even shown the slightest interest in who he was. To her, he was just another man who nearly ran her over. And somehow that made the entire moment feel different. Are you always this calm after almost being hit by a car? He asked. Zuri shrugged. I've had worse days. Her tone was matter-of-fact, not dramatic. She adjusted the flyers in her hands and glanced down the street where pedestrians continued moving around them. Well, she said, stepping slightly aside, unless you plan on running me over again, I should get back to work. Min-Seok watched her turn toward a group of passing commuters, already raising a flyer with an easy smile. Club Aurora this Friday, she called out confidently. Best music in the city. The pedestrians took the papers politely before walking away. Min-Seok remained where he was. Because something about the way she spoke, the way she moved through the crowded street without hesitation, had caught his attention in a way he didn't fully understand yet. For the first time in a very long while, someone had treated Lee Min-Seok like he was completely ordinary. And oddly enough, he wasn't sure he disliked it. The traffic had already begun moving again. Cars slipped past the curb, pedestrians returned to their routines, and the brief moment of tension on the street dissolved back into the usual noise of the afternoon. But Lee Min-Seok didn't get back into the car. He stood beside the open door watching. Across the sidewalk, Zuri Johnson had already returned to work as if the encounter had never happened. Club Aurora this Friday, she called out to a pair of passing students, offering them flyers with a quick smile. Live DJ, hip-hop and R&B. They took the papers politely before disappearing into the crowd. She moved on to the next group without hesitation. Min-Seok folded his arms slightly, studying her the way he studied unfamiliar opportunities in business. Carefully, quietly, looking for what made them different. She worked with energy that didn't look forced. There was pride in it. Even when people ignored her, even when someone tossed a flyer into a nearby trash bin only a few steps later, she didn't react with frustration. She simply pulled another flyer from the stack and offered it to the next stranger walking by. Persistence. The driver cleared his throat gently. Sir, should we continue to the office? Min-Seok didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched as Zuri approached an older couple walking slowly down the sidewalk. Excuse me, she said politely, handing them each a flyer. If you're looking for a good place to dance this weekend, this is it. The couple laughed softly before thanking her and continuing down the street. She didn't look tired. But there were small details Min-Seok noticed now. The worn edges of the sneakers on her feet. The faint crease in the stack of flyers from being held too tightly. The quick glance she gave the remaining pile, quietly measuring how many she had left. This wasn't a hobby. It was survival. Sir, the driver asked again. Min-Seok finally spoke. Wait. The driver blinked but nodded. Min-Seok's gaze returned to Zuri. A year ago, she might have been invisible to him. Someone working a small street job, struggling through the same crowded city that millions of others fought through every day. But now he found himself paying attention. Not because she was trying to impress him, but because she clearly wasn't. Zuri suddenly noticed him still standing there. She paused mid-step, one eyebrow lifting. You're still here. Her tone carried mild amusement, as if the situation itself was strange. Min-Seok stepped forward slightly. I thought you had work to do. I do. She lifted the stack of flyers. So unless you're planning to take 100 of these and hand them out yourself. Min-Seok glanced at the papers again. How many do you have left? She looked down quickly, counting. 37. Without another word, Min-Seok reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp bill. He held it toward her. Consider the rest distributed. Zuri stared at the money. Then she looked up at him again. For a moment, her expression hardened slightly. You think I'm asking for charity? Min-Seok blinked once, surprised by the sharpness in her voice. That wasn't my intention. She studied him carefully. Then, slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. You almost ran me over, she said. If you really want to help. She held out a single flyer toward him. Take one. Min-Seok looked down at the paper. Then he took it. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain yet. He felt like he had just made a far more interesting investment than any business deal waiting on his desk. Lee Min-Seok returned to his office that afternoon exactly the way he always did. The black sedan carried him through the city's financial district. Security opened the glass doors the moment he arrived. Assistants greeted him with quiet efficiency as he stepped into the towering building that housed his headquarters. Everything was as controlled and precise as it had always been. Yet something felt off. Min-Seok walked into his private office on the top floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline of Seoul. His desk waited with neatly arranged documents, financial reports, and meeting schedules. The same rhythm that had defined his life for years. He sat down and opened the first report. Numbers filled the screen of his tablet. Profit margins, market projections, acquisition timelines. Normally his focus would have locked onto the information immediately. Today his mind drifted. Not far. Just back to a crowded street corner and a woman holding a stack of cheap flyers. He frowned slightly and set the tablet down. Made no sense. He had met thousands of people in his life. Executives, investors, politicians, competitors. None of them had lingered in his thoughts like this. And certainly not a stranger. Yet the image kept returning. The way she had looked directly at him without hesitation. The way she had challenged him without knowing who he was. The way she refused to take his money. Min-Seok leaned back in his chair. His gaze drifting toward the skyline outside the window. It was irrational. There had been nothing extraordinary about the situation. A minor traffic incident. A brief conversation. Nothing more. Yet, his phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Jae-hyun appeared on the screen. Still winning that bet. Min-Seok stared at the words for a moment before setting the phone aside without replying. Because for the first time since accepting the challenge the night before, the bet crossed his mind again. Then his gaze shifted toward the folded paper lying on the corner of his desk. The flyer. He had placed it there without thinking when he walked into the office. Club Aurora. This Friday. Live DJ event. Cheap printing. Bright colors. Slightly wrinkled edges. Min-Seok picked it up slowly. He could almost hear her voice again. Take one. Not buy them. Not pay for them. Just take one. The corner of his mouth moved faintly. It had been a long time since someone refused to treat him like a billionaire. His assistant knocked lightly before stepping into the office. Sir, the board meeting begins in 10 minutes. Min-Seok nodded once. I'll be there shortly. She hesitated briefly before leaving. Min-Seok remained seated. His eyes moved back to the flyer in his hand. A simple piece of paper advertising a nightclub. Yet somehow it felt like an invitation. Not to a party, but to something unpredictable. For years he had carefully designed his life to eliminate unpredictability. And now he was considering walking directly toward it. He placed the flyer back on the desk and stood. For a moment he looked at it again. Then he turned toward the door. But the thought followed him out of the office. Not the nightclub, or Zuri Johnson. And the strange realization that had begun quietly forming in the back of his mind. He wanted to see her again. The rumors started quietly. At first, it was nothing more than small whispers between people who paid attention to the movements of powerful men. Lee Min-Seok had been seen somewhere unusual. Not in a boardroom. Not at an investment summit. Not at one of the carefully curated charity galas where wealthy families paraded their daughters like silent proposals. He had been seen at Club Aurora. More than once. At first the reports sounded ridiculous. Min-Seok wasn't known for nightlife, and certainly not for visiting small clubs in crowded districts of the city. But then the whispers sharpened. 'Cause people noticed something else. He wasn't there for the music. He was there for someone. By the end of the week, the rumors had spread through the quiet social network that connected Seoul's elite families, investors and corporate leaders. And they all said the same thing. Lee Min-Seok was spending time with a woman. Not a celebrity. Not a socialite. Not the daughter of a powerful executive. Flyer girl. And worse, at least in the eyes of some, she was black. Min-Seok first heard the criticism during a private dinner with several of his company's senior partners. The restaurant was elegant and discreet, the kind of place where conversations were meant to stay inside the room. But the tension around the table was impossible to miss. One of the older executives cleared his throat carefully. "Chairman Lee," he began, choosing his words with caution, "there have been discussions lately." Min-Seok continued cutting his steak calmly. "About?" The man hesitated. "Your recent social company." Min-Seok glanced up. Across the table, two other executives avoided eye contact. Another shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Finally the older executive spoke again. "We simply worry about appearances." "Appearances?" Min-Seok repeated evenly. "Yes, you represent several major partnerships now. International investors pay close attention to your public image." Min-Seok set his fork down slowly. "And how exactly does my image concern you tonight?" The man inhaled slightly. "The woman you've been seen with, she may not reflect the kind of reputation expected from someone in your position." The room fell quiet. Everyone understood the implication behind the polite language. Min-Seok's gaze moved calmly around the table. Not one of them looked comfortable. Not one of them had the courage to say the words directly. But he had heard enough. "You're concerned," he said evenly, "because she doesn't belong to your world." The executive shifted in his chair. "It's not about belonging. It's about compatibility." Min-Seok leaned back slightly. For a moment, the calm expression on his face made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. Then he spoke again. "You're right." Several of the men relaxed slightly. But Min-Seok wasn't finished. "She doesn't belong to your world," he continued. His voice remained quiet. "But that may be the most interesting thing about her." Silence returned to the table. Because in that moment, something became clear to everyone in the room. The rumors weren't exaggerations. Lee Min-Seok was not distancing himself from the woman people were criticizing. If anything, he sounded like he was defending her. And in the world of powerful men and fragile reputations, that was far more dangerous than the rumors themselves. By the following week, the rumors had stopped whispering. They were being spoken openly now. Business magazines began publishing subtle articles about Lee Min-Seok's unusual personal choices. Online forums speculated endlessly about the woman seen beside him in several public places. Photos taken from across streets and restaurant windows circulated through social media. In most of them, Zuri looked the same as she always did. Simple clothes, confident posture, her natural curls pulled into a high puff. And beside her stood one of the most powerful men in the country. The contrast fascinated people. It also unsettled them. Min-Seok knew all of this before anyone tried to explain it to him. His assistant quietly placed a tablet on his desk that morning with several headlines already open. He read them without expression. Billionaire chairman linked to unknown woman. Investors question Chairman Lee's public image. Sources say relationship could affect partnerships. Min-Seok closed the tablet and pushed it aside. None of it surprised him. What surprised him was how little it mattered. That evening, a charity gala was scheduled at one of Seoul's most prestigious hotels. Nearly every major figure in the city's corporate and political circles would be there. Normally, Min-Seok attended these events alone. But tonight, when his driver pulled the car to the entrance of the hotel, he stepped out first and walked around to the other side of the vehicle. Zuri looked up at the building, clearly unimpressed by the towering glass entrance and the line of luxury cars waiting to pull forward. "You sure this place isn't going to charge me for breathing their air?" she muttered. Min-Seok almost smiled. "Just stay close to me," he said. "Why?" "Because the moment we walk inside, everyone will start staring." Zuri glanced at him sideways. "They already stare when you walk into a room." "That's not what I meant." The hotel doors opened. Inside, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Conversations hummed softly beneath the music of a small orchestra. For a moment, the crowd continued moving normally. Then someone noticed them. Heads turned. Whispers began. Zuri felt it immediately. The sudden shift in the room, the curiosity mixed with judgment. She leaned slightly toward Min-Seok. "You weren't exaggerating." "No." Across the room, several executives Min-Seok knew well were already watching carefully. One of them approached quickly, his expression tight. "Chairman Lee," he said quietly, "perhaps we should speak privately." Min-Seok didn't move. "This is Zuri Johnson," he said calmly. "The woman I've been spending time with." The man glanced at her briefly before lowering his voice. "This situation is becoming very public. It may be wiser to—" "To what?" Min-Seok asked. The executive hesitated. "Distance yourself." Zuri stiffened slightly beside him. But Min-Seok's voice remained steady. "No." The single word cut cleanly through the conversation. The executive blinked. Min-Seok turned slightly toward Zuri. His posture relaxed but unmistakably firm. "I'm not distancing myself from anyone." The surrounding whispers grew louder. Because in that moment, the message was unmistakable. Lee Min-Seok wasn't hiding the woman beside him. He wasn't apologizing for her. And he certainly wasn't choosing pride or reputation over her presence. For the first time since the rumors began, the billionaire had made his position clear. And he had done it in the most public place possible. The charity gala ended later than expected. Conversations lingered long after the orchestra stopped playing. Clusters of wealthy guests remained scattered across the ballroom, whispering behind polite smiles while discreet glances continued drifting toward the man who had quietly disrupted their expectations. Lee Min-Seok noticed every one of those looks. He simply didn't care. Zuri stood beside him near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. The lights of Seoul stretched endlessly beyond the glass, glowing like scattered gold across the darkness. She held a glass of sparkling water, studying the skyline with quiet amusement. "You know," she said softly, "I'm pretty sure half the people in this room think I'm some kind of social experiment." Min-Seok glanced at her. "Does it bother you?" She shrugged. "I've been underestimated before." The answer came easily, without bitterness. That confidence, the same stubborn independence he had first seen on the street corner, was still there. Min-Seok watched her for a moment before speaking. "It bothers them more than it bothers you." "I figured." A familiar voice suddenly interrupted from behind them. "Well," Jae-hyun Kim said casually, "this is more entertaining than I expected." Min-Seok turned slightly. Jae-hyun approached with the relaxed confidence of someone who enjoyed observing situations unfold exactly the way he predicted. His gaze moved briefly toward Zuri before returning to Min-Seok. "So," he continued, "should we talk about it?" Min-Seok's expression remained calm. "About what?" Jae-hyun chuckled. "You know exactly what." Zuri looked between them with curiosity. "Did I miss something?" Jae-hyun leaned lightly against the nearby table. "A week ago," he said, "your friend here made a very confident claim." Min-Seok sighed quietly. "Jae-hyun," he said. Jae-hyun continued, ignoring him, that there was absolutely no chance he would ever fall in love with a black woman. Zuri blinked once, clearly surprised. "Oh!" Min-Seok rubbed the bridge of his nose briefly. "That conversation was taken out of context." "Was it?" Jae-hyun asked, smiling. Min-Seok didn't respond. Instead, his gaze shifted toward Zuri. She was watching him now, not offended, not angry, just curious, waiting. And in that moment, something settled quietly inside him. The last week replayed in his mind with surprising clarity. The street corner, the flyer, the way she refused his money, the way she walked through a room full of powerful strangers without shrinking, the way she made his carefully controlled world feel unpredictable again. Min-Seok exhaled slowly. Then he looked back at Jae-hyun. "You won." Jae-hyun's grin widened immediately. "I knew it." Zuri tilted her head slightly. "Wait," she said, "that's it? That's the bet?" Min-Seok met her eyes again. "No." His voice was softer now. "That's just the part he predicted." Jae-hyun folded his arms, clearly satisfied. "And the rest?" Min-Seok didn't look away from Zuri. "The rest," he said quietly, "is that he underestimated something too." Zuri raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Min-Seok's answer came without hesitation. "How completely I would fall." For once, Jae-hyun had nothing left to add, because the bet had been simple. But the truth standing in front of them now was something far greater than a victory. It was love. And Lee Min-Seok, the man who believed he controlled everything, had finally discovered the one thing he never could.